Hello once again.
Hello.
This is the last of the three talks that I wanted to give on the Arctic and its exploration. And here we are looking at the abstract picture of the sea ice again. If you remember, we started with Mary Shelley and her description of Captain Walton sailing across the sea ice, and it's an era when the North Pole is an aspiration, unreachable, unknown, indescribable for anybody in Mary Shelley's age. No one has been there, no one can really know what it looks like. But it is a fixation already for at least 100 years in the minds of Europeans. They are interested in getting to the Arctic. And she mentions that, I'll repeat this phrase, that the North Pole is, and how does she phrase it? Anything is possible in a country of eternal light. And so here we see the British officers once again extending themselves into Arctic regions that have never been reached. And we know this leads to the Franklin expedition, as we've talked about, and the loss of 129 men in the best funded effort to go into the Northwest Passage. Shelley hadn't described the Northwest Passage, but it becomes, of course, its own fixation for a while, that they can sail over the top of North America from England and get to the Orient, and that proves impossible. The rescues fail, the attempts to find the Franklin expedition fail, and it ends up in the shame of cannibalism, and it's pretty much responsible for driving the British out of exploration for 50 or 60 years. And then we get to really the subject of this talk, which is Crockerland. Okay. Let's see. Anyway, Crockerland is the imagined piece of property off of the path to the North Pole. This is the aged Peary once more in his Eskimo outfit. He's gone to the North Pole, but or close to the North Pole, 30 or 60 miles from the North Pole. But he has failed on numerous attempts prior to this. And on the previous attempt, he has worried about ever being able to fund another trip to reach the North Pole. And he walks out onto he walks out to the west a few hundred miles and looks out into what is today just the Arctic Ocean, and says he sees a beautiful image of land out there. And I want to read you his words, and you can see why they're so inspiring about the idea of Crockerland. He says, "My heart leaped the intervening miles of ice as I looked longingly at this land, and in fancy I trod its shores and climbed its summits, even though I knew that pleasure would only be for another person in another season." So he leaves the issue for the Crockerland for others to find, but he knows that they won't find it because he knows it isn't there. This is Frederick Cook, his competitor for reaching the North Pole. As far as Americans are concerned, it's a double victory. Which one of these have reached the North Pole first, doesn't matter. It's an American. But his claim is weaker, and he isn't up to the difficulty of arguing the issue. And Peary has connections with institutions and other explorers who all verify that he is the most reputable explorer they've ever met, and they give him the credit for reaching the North Pole. After looking at this picture once before, I realized the photographer really didn't want to take this picture 1 second later. If you look at the dog, you'll see what I mean. But Cook, more demonstrably, isn't telling the truth about reaching the North Pole. And after the North Pole is reached, the interest turns immediately to the South Pole. Amundsen, who you see here looking at a map, was in Norway at the time that the word reached him that Peary had come to the North Pole. And he immediately changed his plans. His plans had been that he would be the first to the North Pole. And so instead of getting off the boat and unpacking it and telling his sailors to go home, he decides he'll sail to the South Pole. It's obvious. And but he's got problems. He's got people who have loaned him money on the belief of going to the North Pole. And the North Pole is a much better prize than the South Pole. And so at night, in the middle of the night, his crew is asleep. He starts the engine on the boat, and they start sailing for the South Pole. This is a picture of Robert Falcon Scott, who has been planning to go to the North Pole, to the South Pole. Everybody knows that the South Pole is to be his, and now Amundsen has jumped in and made a race of it. And as you know, Amundsen is the much better planner. He's the much more skilled person. Scott has only been to the Arctic, to these polar regions once. Amundsen has lived his whole life trying to extend his experiences in the polar regions, and he not only beats Scott to the pole, but Scott dies in the process. So the North Pole has been reached, the South Pole has been reached. There is this thing called Crocker Land out there. Who's going to go there? Well, let's start out in Seattle. This is a picture of a man from Chicago by the name of John Borden. He's a friend of William Boeing, and I got into this subject because I was trying to find out what else William Boeing was doing in 1916 besides looking around at airplanes and giving thought to flying. And what Boeing was also doing was saying, well, maybe I'd like to go on a cruise into the Arctic with John. This is a little bit earlier, 1913. John Borden has a boat in Seattle called the Adventurous, and it's still here. If you go over to Port Townsend, it's a big white schooner that is used for cadet training. And but in 1916, he just makes a decision that he wants to go to the Arctic, and he doesn't describe why he's going there, but the reasons are fairly obvious. You only have to look at his ship in detail to know he's set his sights on reaching Crocker Land. And here we have his ship. Oops. Here we have his ship. It's called the Great Bear. I'll point out one little side matter. You'll see it has lots of lifeboats. This is 4 years after the Titanic, and lifeboats are a big issue. So anyway, this is a ship that has maybe 130 feet long. Its interiors are fitted out much better than any sort of exploration ship, but it has a hull that is all wood, but the wood is 28 inches thick. This is more than 2 feet of wood all the way around the hull. It's lined with iron wood, a material called ironwood. It's done everything that it can to survive the pressures that the ice will cause. But there are so many delays in building the ship that it isn't really ready to go north. It's only ready late in the season, and so they know that they're not going to go for Crocker Land in that season. The other thing that's happened is not only is the ship not ready, but the people that he's wanted to go with him have begged out for the most part, including Boeing. There's another man who's a big game hunter. He's decided not to go. Another one who's a publisher. He's not decided not to go. The only person who goes with him is an insurance salesman that he knows. And this ship is uninsured, and it's going to have a so oops, let's go back. The captain that he chooses is this man who lived in Fremont, named Lewis Lane. And Lewis Lane is one of those sort of waterfront characters, not entirely reliable or trustworthy. If you ever saw the movie Key Largo, where Humphrey Bogart plays this questionable sea captain who goes fishing with or without the government's approval or things like that. This is Lewis Lane. And both he and Borden describe themselves as explorers, which means something quite, I think, quite different than it means today. It means more of an adventurer, a person who's up for anything, who wants to run some risk and go where others haven't gone. And Lewis Lane and Borden, when they reached the Pribilof Islands, there are only 3 groups of islands in the Bering Sea. When they reached the Pribilofs, the first group, they hear that on St. Matthew Island, the second group, that there is a shipwreck, and that they will go. And they decide, well, they're so late in the season, they might as just well go there and scavenge the shipwreck and maybe pick up the people that are left there. And they go there and they reach the vicinity of St. Matthew Island at 12 o'clock at night under cloudy circumstances. They haven't quite taken account of the local currents, and they end up on a rock 7 miles away from St. Matthew Island, and they have themselves to be rescued. Lewis Lane has in the past gone to the Arctic and met with Stephenson. And as you remember, Stephenson is this young man who was a part of an effort to measure the depth of the Arctic. And you were going to use the measure of the depth of the Arctic as a good indicator of whether there was anything called Crocker Land. If it was deep, it was very unlikely to be an island out there. And they find out that the Arctic is deep. And in fact, it's about 14,000 feet deep at the North Pole. In any event, Stephenson doesn't reach that conclusion for reasons I don't know, he never said, and decides that Crocker Land really must exist. And he's also involved in sort of doing a lot of writing, creating an image around the idea of the North Pole. And I've mentioned it before, the idea that the empires of the world will move northward, and the Arctic Ocean will become the Mediterranean of the future, and that people will tend to put their great cities around it. But he's also does a number of things that are that earn him a bad reputation. He sends a boat into the Arctic and it's crushed by the ice and a third of the crew dies. He tries to make an American or Canadian grab of a Russian island and sends 5 people there, of which 4 of them die from starvation. And he writes about blonde Eskimos with the implication that they have a Norwegian history, which is not true, at least from what I hear. And he meets, and Lane, the captain of the Great Bear, meets him in the 1913 period, a few years before, and Lane comes back and he tells that he rescued Stephenson. He'd found him wandering, sort of uncertain, confused on an island. Well, Stephenson was a much better Arctic explorer than Lane ever was. In any event, Stephenson creates this image of a friendly Arctic, and that he will somehow reach he will go offshore on foot and reach the region of Crockerland. And I can't find any suitable images except this one, of which where they have put 2 images together, one above the other. And what you can see is, in the upper image, is the men building an igloo with the dogs all laid out on the snow in front of them. And the other ones, where the men are demonstrating what a sturdy object a snow dome can possibly be. When I see igloos, I think of the Gary Larson cartoon. You know, where the 2 polar bears are standing over an igloo and one of them says to the other, "I love these things. Crunchy on the outside, chewy on the inside." Here we see the Maud. This is the Norwegian boat that Amundsen builds in about 1921. What you see it here is pictured at the bottom of Queen Anne Hill, at an oil dock. The Maud is his idea of doing what John Borden wants to do, is sail into the Arctic, get locked in the ice, drift all the way to the North Pole, and do this in some comfort. He gets north of Russia, puts it in the ice, and instead of drifting to the North Pole, it just stays there. It's locked in the ice, and 1 season, 2 seasons, 2.5 seasons, and he realizes this is disaster. And in fact, it is a disaster. One night, and there's only one night in the Arctic, it starts in September, you know, and one night he hears something outside of the Maud, and he walks down the gangplank, he looks around, sees nothing, and is attacked by a polar bear, and he's mauled pretty severely. And his dog saved him. The dog attacked the bear, and Amundsen went up the ramp. I hope he didn't eat the dog. And he also has heart problems. So eventually he manages to get the boat out of the ice, back into the open sea, and come back to Seattle in order to see a doctor and get himself repaired. This is Amundsen in Seattle again. He'd been here once before. And by this point, Amundsen's reputation in Norway has declined severely. He's been a national hero once before, but at this point, he has been in the Arctic too long. His debts have come due, and people are asking him to be repaid, and he can't do that, and he's pretty much bankrupt. And that's largely due to, I think, to the length of the trip. He's losing support in Norway, but in Seattle, he is gold, and he comes to Seattle. Everybody welcomes him from the Scandinavian community. The one person gives him an office in downtown Seattle, which is what you see him doing here. I don't know anything about the bolts of fabric that seem to be behind him. The Norwegian consulate has a nice house in Seattle. He gives it to Amundsen to use. Amundsen thinks, well, what do I do at this point? And by this point, he decides, well, let's make a flight over and see what's at the North Pole. Airplanes are extremely expensive. There are $100,000 items, anything that's of any size. And he runs into a Danish used ship broker. This is a little bit like a used car dealer. And the man's name is Håkon Hammer. And Hammer says, no problem about this at all. This is, I'm sure I can raise the money. And Håkon Hammer is not really up to his words. He says he's going to get money by spending a lot of money, and it goes all much worse for Amundsen. Amundsen has already fired his brother as his accountant, so this is not a good situation. But Amundsen has a curious phrase that I love when he refers to Håkon Hammer. He describes him as criminally optimistic. The other thing that Hammer is very optimistic about is that if he finds funding for this trip, these airplanes, that he will go along. And Amundsen is incensed at this. He's not going to let this soft person go ride on the airplane with him. He's going to have real explorers. This is the book that he writes after that polar trip. He manages to raise the money largely because a man named Lincoln Ellsworth comes forward, who is going to inherit a lot of money, and against his inheritance he borrows the money to buy a pair of two-engine airplanes, and they're going to fly to the North Pole and see what's there. Now, of course, all of them believe Peary already has told them what they've done, but the problem with this idea is that these airplanes will only make it like 80% of the way to the North Pole, and I don't understand why they think they're going to reach the North Pole. But the two airplanes take off. They don't. One of them goes down. The second one, knowing that it has to save the first one, goes down. They're on. One of them is wrecked. They all get into one airplane, and then they have to level the ice field that they're on, and they spend a month and a half leveling it, by which time everybody back in Norway or around the world thinks that Amundsen has died. But no, like he always does, he always comes back, and so he is saved once more, and he thinks about, well, how do I get to the North Pole by air? And dirigible. This is going to be Richard Byrd, an American naval officer who is also an extremely ambitious man, and he has plans of beating Amundsen to the North Pole, and he's another famed seeker, and he goes to Svalbard, the island north of Norway, off into the fairly far into the Arctic, one of the certainly Europe's furthest north piece of land and sets up shop next to Amundsen, who plans to go there with the dirigible. This is Richard Byrd's airplane. It's a Fokker three-motor airplane. You can see just the two motors in this picture, and it honestly lacks range too, so I don't quite know what's going on. But anyway, he flies off the day ahead of Amundsen and comes back and says, well, I made it. Well, you know how much evidence there is for that. He's another one of this era of liars, so. But his claims are believed, and that's another thing I don't understand. It's fairly clear that this airplane doesn't have enough fuel to make it to the North Pole. The other thing about a curious little thing is that these engines, the engines of the era, are so unreliable that you're never certain whether you should have one engine or three engines. The Russians, when they start making their polar flights, use one engine because they say one engine fails and you are forced to land and you don't survive. Three engines triple the likelihood that you will fail. So it's really counterintuitive, but Richard Byrd chooses the three-engine path. The reason that an engine failure will bring you down is because the propellers will not turn, and they just cause so much drag that you can't go on, and you won't make it back. This is a picture of a poster that Amundsen puts up, and this one is from Fargo, North Dakota. How do you support how do you keep buying airplanes and dirigibles? Well, you have to raise an awful lot of money, and he needs $100,000 to make this. Excuse me, he needs $300,000 to make this trip, and the $100,000 will come from Ellsworth, his acquaintance, and the other money he has to raise by going on tours and writing books, and he's very successful at this. This is the price you probably can't read, but it's $1 per person. So he has to have probably about 200,000 people listen to his lecture in order to afford this trip. He'll actually get a lot of money from the King of Norway and other sponsors. But this process this exploration is extremely expensive to do. The other thing is that Amundsen is a very spendthrift type of person himself, and when he's in New York, he stays at the Waldorf Astoria. So the costs for his life are pretty high. The four men who will comprise his dirigible trip are shown here. The navigator is on the far left. Amundsen is the second from the left. Lincoln Ellsworth is third from the left. And the person who builds the dirigible and will pilot it with the dog in his carrier in his hand is Umberto Nobile. And the dog will come along too. And from the instant they see each other, Amundsen and Nobile already are angry, and they hate each other from then on. Nothing is going to make this trip easy. This is the dirigible. It's although it looks big, it's a very small dirigible, and it's only 350 feet long, which means it's the size of a football field with its end zones included. It can carry 22 tons. Most of those are its own weight and a little bit more. It has a maximum speed of 62 miles an hour. So it's pretty slow, and there are 2,000 miles for what he plans. And what he plans is not a trip to the North Pole. It's a trip across the Arctic from Svalbard to the Alaskan coast. And when people have said, well, why are you doing this? You're going to be the third person after Byrd to go to the North Pole. And he says, well, I don't care. It's not my destination anyway. My destination is Alaska. And the reason he's going to Alaska is because he wants to fly over that unexplored territory to the south of the North Pole, and see if he can find Crocker Land. And this is fairly well discussed before the flight. It's not discussed after the flight because Crocker Land doesn't exist. And you don't want to say, I made this flight to find a spot that doesn't exist. So, in any event, the other thing I'd point out is this is only a semi-rigid dirigible. It's not a high-quality one. And all dirigibles are pretty unsafe. Even the most modern ones that I've heard about seem to have accidents. And recently, about half a year ago, the British had built one. They said that it had all the safety features that an airship would ever need, and it has since crashed. So I don't think they've solved the problems of dirigibles at all. In any event, to move on, there's the fight between Amundsen and Nobile continue. Nobile considers himself the leader of this exploration. Amundsen is a tourist and coming along. And Amundsen's feeling is that he is the commandant of this flight, and Nobile is the hired pilot. And so they never see things the same. But in their many arguments, Nobile tends to win them because he knows this dirigible. He's built the dirigible, he's its engineer, he knows what can be done and can't be done. And for example, he convinces Amundsen that the Norwegians can't wear their heavy clothing on this flight. And then Nobile's contingent shows up with heavy clothing. Nobile convinces Amundsen that when they want to drop their flags over the North Pole, that Amundsen can only have handkerchief-sized flags. And then Nobile drops a rug-sized flag for his. So they disagree on every possible things, and these are only minor matters, of course, in the whole process. Amundsen isn't worried about, as I said, isn't worried about Byrd getting to the North Pole. He's only interested in the portion of the North Pole south to the Alaskan coast. This is a closer view of the gondola on this airship. It's going to hold 10 people. There'll be, let me go back for a second. Where you see the engines, which are here, and then 2 on the back here, there are people inside who will spend the whole trip, the whole 43 and a half hours out there on these engine mounts. The rest of and there will be 10 people inside this fairly small space here. When they get to the North Pole, where Amundsen says, I'm going to take the ship from here on, and he does, and he's intent on being out there in the front where the glass is, so that he can see in all directions, make sure that he'll be the first to spot any land if there is
Well,
any.
not everybody will know that Spitsbergen is the same thing as Svalbard.
Yes, this Spitsbergen has been renamed Svalbard.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So you can see that if you get up close, you can see that this is a pretty small gondola on this vessel, and the rest of it is what you see is fabric. It's not. Partway through the trip, the propellers start throwing ice at the fabric, and they think that it's going to rip into their support, their airbag. It's just one of the many things that you have to worry about on a.
What gas were they using? Do you know? What gas?
Yeah.
They're probably diesels, but I don't know.
No, I meant, no. Is it hydrogen or helium?
Oh, they're going to be using hydrogen.
Thank you.
And of course, as you know, hydrogen explodes in give you the proportions. Hydrogen will explode with oxygen in proportions of 1 to 99 or 99 to 1.
Right.
It's an extremely bad gas to use. American dirigibles all use helium, but it doesn't solve all the dirigibles' problems. At some point, just before the flight, Amundsen makes a remark to the press, and I can't remember it exactly, but it goes, "Any land that we might discover will be the most valuable on Earth until man reaches the moon." He had no idea. The 43 hours later, they reached the coast of Alaska, but the coast of Alaska is pretty unpopulated, and their real goal is to make it a little bit south to Nome, but to do that, they have to go to the Bering Straits. They run into a storm. The storm drives them into Russia, and it takes them hours and hours to get back. And then when they finally get back to a town 30 miles from Nome, it's still very extremely windy, and they decide to take it down. And they know it's going to be a crash landing because there are no handlers out there to grab the ropes to hold it. And it will take dozens and dozens of handlers to hold an object like this. And so the airplane is the Norgay is this dirigible is destroyed in the process of reaching Nome.
Wow.
This is another map that is shown immediately after the trip, and I hope you can understand it all. This is from here is Alaska, Canada, and then of course Greenland you can read without any trouble. Here's Spitzer and Svalbard, and as you can see, it's a pretty straight shot over the pole to Alaska. When they reach Nome, Amundsen, who has lots of contracts for his story, and he relies on them, he runs for the telegraph office, and Nobile is already there. Nobile has promised that he will not write any stories or anything, and yet he's in violation of those contracts. Now, most of the things that I know about this are written by Americans or Norwegians. So Nobile's story is probably better than I've presented it. Let's see. The fights between Nobile and Amundsen are not very good for either of them. They're destructive of the interest in this Arctic flight, and they never make as much money off of it as they really need to and are dependent upon. Amundsen is already in his 50s. I don't know Nobile's age, but here's a picture of the two in the next couple years after the flight. Amundsen, as you see, looks like a very old man. He's also become cranky. He writes a pair of books, one of the trip across the Arctic and the other one is a memoir. Both of them are have signs of paranoia in them. He writes it with the purpose of settling old scores, and maybe even instances of early dementia. And on the right you see Nobile on the far right in this picture, and in between them is Mussolini. In the middle is Mussolini, because this is fascist Italy in 1928, and the government wants to control all these things, and it wants to take the credit for it. And this successful flight, of course, is just up, it redounds to the notion of Italy as a modern state with excellent engineering and talent. This also is Nobile is bothered by the fact that Amundsen has gotten more credit for the Norwegian flight, the transpolar flight, and he decides that he will do this flight over again and go back and find those missing islands, or Crocker Land, and you realize Crocker Land is not, as I mentioned, I think in the last lecture, Crocker Land is not expected to be a small thing. It's either a large, very large island, an archipelago, or possibly as big as that whole shaded area that I showed you before. Some people think there's a continent out there of more than 1 million square miles. So Nobile is going to go back and find this thing. And he goes back to the North Pole, he doesn't see anything, comes back to Svalbard, and 30 miles from Svalbard, he runs into a storm, and the airship that he's created, the Italia, is driven down onto the ice, and the gondola is ripped off of the envelope, as they say, and he's deposited on the ice with 9 other men. He has broken ribs, he has a broken arm, he has a broken leg. There are people there that are even worse off than him. And the rest of the airship has gone off with 6 men who are never found again out on their engine pods. And at that point, the fascists in Italy turned against Nobile for disgracing the country. Again, all these adventures are highly nationalistic.
Paul, you should tell me which man is which.
Oh, this is Nobile. This is Mussolini. And I have no identification for this person.
Thank you.
So the question of Crocker Land still is settled for most people's purposes. From the Amundsen has said that he saw nothing along the trip. He's been able from 2,000 to 3,000 feet in the air, look 60 miles out probably on either side, maybe a bit less, and that's a big swath of land across the Arctic. But the other ones say, well, what about this huge area that you didn't see? And so the idea of Crocker Land goes on, and you'll see in this next. This is Sir Hubert Wilkins. He's an Australian, and he also flies the route across. This is not a very good map, but he also flies the route across the Arctic, not the one that Amundsen did, but about 200 miles to well, I was going to say to the south, but everything's to the south. 200 miles away, and he doesn't see anything. And then other people fly different directions across the Arctic. We're now talking the 30s, and the Arctic is crossed every possible way, and nobody ever finds anything, of course. That's the reason for the comment, or the title, The Last Place Not on Earth.
Yeah.
And eventually we get up to World War II, and I'm now really past the whole period, the period that I wanted to cover. I wanted to take the whole notion of the exploration of the Arctic through to the end of Crockerland. After World War II, I don't think anybody has the same view of the Arctic that these people that I described have. They know what the Arctic looks like if they've ever read a National Geographic magazine. There isn't any mystery left in the Arctic. Its qualities or the lack of potential isn't what Stephenson describes, and it never will be. And as time goes on, people will start doubting these people like Peary and Cook and Byrd. Amundsen's the only one who tells the truth in all of this. And he gets all the prizes. Even though Peary got the prize for finding the North Pole, he lost it again when people started examining and who was the first person to fly across the North Pole? Amundsen. And so Amundsen is the great hero of all these tales of the Arctic. And this is, of course, in the post-World War II era. The Arctic now is a place that you can, or the North Pole is a place you can go fly to, as a friend of mine once did. It's a place that you can go on a cruise ship, which will just blast its way through the ice to the North Pole. In 1968, a man from Minnesota who was entranced by snowmobiles took one to the North Pole. Another person a Japanese person took a motorcycle to the North Pole. There are people who have skied to the North Pole on their own and come back supported. And in 1995, there's somebody who skied to the North Pole and came back without any support from air or fuel or in any other way. So the North Pole is now a neighbor of ours, and the story is over. It's a different North Pole.
Wow.
Thank you very much. If I've left anything unsaid, I entertain it. I'll try to answer your questions.
Paul?
Yes.
Paul, is there a marker there?
Well, people for purposes, have put a little barber pole, I've seen in pictures at the spot. I've seen pictures where all the people get off the cruise ship and surround the North Pole. Yes. Yeah.
Any marker wouldn't stay there.
No, it has to be, the marker has to be renewed every time.
When I was up in the Arctic, we ran into some Russians who had camped out on the ice. And this is apropos of the dogs rescuing Amundsen from the polar bear.
Yes.
Yeah, they had video, they wanted to exchange movies and video with the people on the ship. They wanted R-rated stuff, which they didn't get for some reason in Russia. And they had this video that they gave us. It showed a couple of dogs, a polar bear coming up near their camp, and a couple of dogs, woof, 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 chasing after the polar bear. All the polar bear did was stop for a moment, turn his head, and the dog screeched to a pop and ran back to it. So Amundsen had more courageous dogs, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know how the Inuit do it. They must rely on the dogs to protect them. Sure.
We had rifles.
If conditions are right, you can get mirages that will show very distant landscapes or imitation landscapes.
Yes.
Has anybody ever speculated that Quakerland sightings were mirages?
Oh, yeah.
Well, that certainly has been offered as an explanation, but since Peary wrote in his diary, when he reached at that point on the end of the land and looked out into the sea, he says, I don't see any land out there. And then when he wrote his book on the experience, the early drafts don't mention Crocker Land. So we're pretty sure he didn't see a mirage, and we're pretty sure he wasn't delusional. So. Okay, well, thank you very much.